In 1887, a railway survey crew entered the forests of Vancouver Island to mark timber. Within 4 days, they found footprints that shouldn't exist. By the 6th day, one of them had vanished without a trace. The company buried the report, but the surveyor who survived wrote everything down. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed, because some stories were never meant to be forgotten. The forest of Northern Vancouver Island held no sound the morning we entered it. Not the way silence feels when you're alone and alert, but the kind that presses on your ears until you hear blood moving through your skull. I had worked timber camps from Oregon to the Fraser Valley for 6 years by then, and I knew the feel of healthy woods. This was not that. My name is Samuel Hurst. I turned 24 that spring of 1887, worked as a timber surveyor for the Canadian Pacific Railway, and carried a brass compass that my father gave me before he died. The work was simple enough. Mark trees, measure distances, record the grade, and report back to the engineers. 4 weeks in, 4 weeks out. Good pay for a man who could handle isolation and rough ground. The crew they sent with me numbered 5 men. Jack Brennan ran the operation, a broad-shouldered Scot who'd logged the interior for a decade and didn't waste breath on small talk. Thomas Perry was our faller, lean and quick with an axe, always humming hymns under his breath. David Reed and Peter Calloway were buckers, brothers from Nova Scotia who spoke in a rhythm only they understood. And then there was William Fletcher, young, 18 at most, hired because his uncle knew someone in the company office. He had soft hands and a nervous habit of checking his pockets as if something might vanish from them. We arrived at the trailhead on the 2nd Tuesday of May, unloaded our gear from the wagon, and watched the driver turn his horses back toward the settlement without a word. The sky hung low and gray, and the trees ahead stood so dense that daylight barely touched the ground between them. Sitka spruce, Douglas fir, western red cedar, all of it towering and old, thick with moss that looked black in the dim light. Brennan shouldered his pack and checked the map. The railway line was planned to cut through this valley and meet the coast near a fishing camp 20 miles north. Our job was to mark a corridor 2 chains wide through the thickest part of the forest, noting obstacles, calculating timber value, and setting stakes every quarter mile. It should have taken us 3 weeks. We were back in 6 days. On the first afternoon, we followed an old game trail that angled northwest through the undergrowth. The ground was soft with decades of needles and rot, and our boots sank deep enough to leave clear prints. Fletcher kept looking back at them as if checking we hadn't strayed. The air smelled of damp earth and cedar oil, and every now and then a branch would crack somewhere distant. But no birds called, and I saw no squirrels. No signs of life beyond the trees themselves. Thomas stopped to mark a large spruce near a dry creek bed. He blazed the bark with his hatchet, carving the company mark clean and deep, and as he stepped back to admire the work, he paused. "You hear that?" he said. None of us had. He tilted his head and listened for a long moment, then shook it off and moved on. But I noticed the hymn had stopped. We made camp that evening in a small clearing where the canopy opened just enough to let in fading light. Brennan built a fire while the rest of us strung a tarp between 2 trees and laid out our bedrolls. The flames took slow, the wood damp and reluctant, and when they finally caught, the smoke rose straight up without a breeze to bend it. I boiled coffee in a tin pot and passed it around. No one spoke much. The silence from the forest had followed us into camp. Fletcher broke the quiet as we ate. "There's no game here," he said, chewing on hard biscuit. "Not even a rabbit. Don't that strike you odd?" David Reed shrugged. "Could be we're just early in the season. Animals move where the food is." But his brother Peter didn't answer. And I noticed he kept his eyes on the tree line, scanning left to right in a slow, deliberate pattern. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps circling the camp. Heavy, deliberate, placed with care on the soft ground. I lay still in my bedroll and listened. The fire had burned low, just a bed of coals giving off faint orange light. And in that glow, I could see the shapes of the other men, all of them motionless. The footsteps moved closer, then stopped. I heard breathing, deep and slow, coming from just beyond the edge of the firelight. Then it moved again, continuing its circle, and after a long pause, it faded into the woods. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of the camp. The ground showed no tracks, not even our own from the night before. The moss and duff looked undisturbed, as if nothing had walked there at all. But near the base of a cedar, I found a strange mark, a set of deep scratches in the bark, too high for a bear, too clean for claws. They ran vertical, 4 lines spaced evenly, each one as wide as my thumb. Brennan studied them without touching. "Could be a cat," he said. "Cougar, maybe, marking territory." Thomas shook his head. "I've seen cougar marks. They don't go that high, they don't space like that." Brennan looked at him, then at the rest of us. "We keep moving," he said. "Mark the line, stay together, and keep your heads clear." We pushed deeper into the forest that day, and the light grew thinner. The trees closed in overhead until the sky was just a faint gray strip between black branches. The underbrush thickened, and we had to cut our way through in places, hacking at salal and devil's club with our axes. The work was slow, and by midday we had covered less than a mile. Peter found the first footprint near a shallow stream. It was pressed into the soft mud of the bank, clear and fresh, narrow at the heel and wide at the toes. Too large for a man, too narrow for a bear. The edges were sharp, as if whatever made it had walked through recently, and beside it lay a second print, then a third, leading upstream into a thick stand of hemlock. We stood around it in silence. Fletcher crouched and held his hand over the print for scale. His fingers didn't cover half of it. "What makes a track like that?" he asked, his voice thin. No one answered. David Reed looked upstream, then back at Brennan. "We should mark it and move on," he said. Brennan nodded, but I saw his jaw tighten. That afternoon, Thomas climbed a tall fir to get a view of the surrounding country. We needed to verify our position against the map and see if the valley ahead was passable. He went up fast, using the branches like ladder rungs. And when he reached a height where he could see over the canopy, he stopped. We waited below, watching. He stayed up there for a long time, not moving, just looking. When he finally came down, his face was pale. "What did you see?" Brennan asked. Thomas shook his head slowly. "Nothing," he said. "That's the problem. No smoke, no clearings, no trails. Just trees, miles of it, and..." He hesitated, glancing back up at the trunk. "I saw something moving out there. Tall, upright, keeping pace with us about a half-mile south." He looked at each of us in turn. It stopped when I looked at it. Just stood there watching. Then it stepped back into the shadows. Brennan told him it was likely a bear standing on its hind legs, common enough when they're curious. Thomas didn't argue, but I could see he didn't believe it. Neither did I. We had all felt it by then. The weight of being observed. The sense that the forest itself had turned its attention toward us. We made camp early that evening, choosing a spot with good sight lines and our backs to a massive cedar stump. Brennan ordered us to keep the fire small and to take watches in pairs. He didn't explain why, and no one asked. As darkness fell, the silence deepened. Not a single insect chirped. The fire crackled, but even that sound seemed muffled, swallowed by the trees. During my watch, I sat with Peter Reed, both of us facing outward, rifles across our knees. The firelight barely reached 10 feet, and beyond that was only black. After an hour, Peter leaned close and whispered, "You see that?" I followed his gaze. At the edge of the light, something stood between two trees. Tall, motionless, partially obscured by a low-hanging branch. It had the shape of a man, but wrong proportions, shoulders too wide, arms too long. We watched it for a full minute. It didn't move. Then, without sound, it stepped backward into the dark and vanished. We didn't speak of what we'd seen until morning. When dawn finally broke, thin and gray through the canopy, Peter and I told the others. Fletcher's hands shook as he rolled his bedding. David kept looking over his shoulder while he packed. Thomas said nothing, just checked his axe edge and waited. Brennan stood by the dead fire, arms crossed, jaw set. "We finished the survey," he said. "Marked the next 2 miles, set the stakes, then we turn back. 3 days' work if we move fast." No one argued, but I could see the doubt in their faces. We had come to map timber, not to chase shadows or explain footprints that shouldn't exist. But we had contracts, and Brennan was the kind of man who honored them even when common sense suggested otherwise. We broke camp and moved northwest along the planned route. The forest remained silent. No wind stirred the branches. No birds broke the stillness. Our footsteps on the soft ground and the occasional strike of an axe against bark were the only sounds that reached our ears. It felt wrong, like walking through a place that had been abandoned by everything living. Around mid-morning, Thomas stopped to blaze another tree. As he raised his hatchet, he paused and leaned close to the trunk. "There's marks here already," he said. We gathered around. Carved into the bark were deep gouges, vertical lines in sets of 4, the same spacing I'd seen the day before. But these were fresh, the wood beneath still pale and weeping sap. "We're the first crew through here," Brennan said quietly. "Company confirmed it. No one's marked this timber." Fletcher stepped back from the tree. "Then what made those?" His voice cracked at the edges. Brennan didn't answer. He ran his fingers along the marks, then wiped the sap on his trousers. "We keep moving," he said. But his tone had changed. The certainty was gone. By noon, we reached a slope that descended into a narrow ravine. The map showed a creek at the bottom, a good place to refill canteens and rest before the climb on the far side. The descent was steep, and we picked our way down carefully, using roots and saplings for handholds. The air grew colder as we dropped, and a faint smell rose from below, sharp and metallic, like rust soaking into wet wood. At the bottom, we found the creek, shallow and sluggish, its water dark with tannins. But we also found something else. Scattered along the bank were bones. Deer, from the size of them, stripped clean and white, arranged in small piles at even intervals. 6 piles in total, each one topped with a smooth river stone. No scavengers had touched them. No moss or lichen had begun to grow. They looked fresh, placed recently, with purpose. David crouched beside the nearest pile and lifted the stone. Beneath it lay a vertebra, split cleanly down the center. He set the stone back down without a word. Peter stood at the water's edge, staring upstream into the shadows. "We shouldn't drink here," he said. Brennan nodded. "We don't. We fill up from the next source." He turned to face the slope we'd just descended, and we climbed back out. Now. We were halfway up the ravine when the sound started. A low, resonant hum, not quite animal, not quite wind. It came from upstream, carried on air that didn't move. The sound rose and fell in slow waves, vibrating in the chest. And as it grew louder, I felt my teeth ache from the frequency. Fletcher dropped to his knees and covered his ears. Thomas grabbed his arm and pulled him upright. "Don't stop," he hissed. "Keep climbing." We reached the top of the ravine and didn't pause. Brennan set a hard pace through dense undergrowth, hacking at branches with his axe, forcing a path where none existed. The hum followed us for another 100 yards, then stopped abruptly, cut off as if a door had closed. In the silence that followed, I heard my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. That evening, we camped on high ground near a rocky outcrop that gave us clear views in 3 directions. Brennan ordered no fire. We ate cold rations and spoke in whispers. As darkness settled, the forest below us seemed to shift and breathe, shadows moving between the trees in patterns that defied the stillness of the air. During the first watch, I sat with Thomas. He kept his rifle across his lap and his eyes on the tree line. After an hour, he leaned close and said, "I've been in the bush for 10 years, logged from the caribou to the coast. I've seen bears, cougars, wolves. I know what moves in the dark." He paused. "This ain't any of that." I asked him what he thought it was. He shook his head. "Don't know, but it don't want us here." Near midnight, Fletcher woke screaming. We scrambled from our bedrolls, rifles raised, searching the darkness. He sat upright, eyes wide, breathing in short gasps. "It was here," he said, pointing to the space between his bedroll and the outcrop. "Standing right there, looking at me." I could see its eyes. Brennan grabbed his shoulders. "What did it look like?" Fletcher swallowed hard. "Like a man, but taller, skin like bark, arms too long, it didn't blink, just stared." We searched the area but found nothing. No tracks, no disturbance in the pine needles, no sign anything had been there at all. Brennan kept us awake the rest of the night, all of us sitting in a tight circle, backs to each other, watching the forest. At dawn, he made his decision. "We're turning back," he said. "Mark what we've done, pack light, and move fast. We'll report the findings and recommend a different route." No one objected. We gathered our gear, abandoned the heavier equipment, and started back the way we'd come. The forest felt different in daylight, no less oppressive but somehow more aware. Every shadow seemed too deep, every gap between trees too deliberate. I had the constant sensation of eyes on my back, but when I turned, there was nothing. By midday, we reached the dry creek bed where Thomas had made his first blaze. The mark was still there, carved into the spruce bark, but beneath it, someone, or something, had added more lines. They formed a pattern I didn't recognize, symbols that looked almost like letters, but not from any alphabet I knew. Thomas stared at them, then looked at Brennan. "We didn't do this," he said. "I know," Brennan replied. We pushed on, faster now, barely pausing to catch our breath. The silence pressed harder. My ears rang with the absence of sound, and I found myself breathing through my mouth just to hear something familiar. Peter stumbled on a root and caught himself against a tree. When he pulled his hand away, it was smeared with something dark and sticky. Not sap. It had the consistency of blood, but smelled like damp earth and rot. David pulled him away from the tree. We kept moving. The afternoon light began to fade earlier than it should have, shadows stretching long before the sun reached the horizon. Brennan led us off the trail, cutting through dense brush toward a ridge he remembered from the first day. If we could reach it before dark, we'd have defensible ground and a clear view of anything approaching. We climbed in silence, lungs burning, legs aching. Behind us, I heard a sound like branches snapping in sequence, one after another, moving closer. I didn't look back. None of us did. We reached the ridge as the last light bled from the sky, and Brennan ordered us into a tight formation among a cluster of boulders. "No sleep tonight," he said. "Watch, and at first light, we run." The night that followed was the longest of my life. We sat shoulder to shoulder, rifles loaded, eyes scanning the darkness. Shapes moved below us in the valley, tall and upright, gliding between trees without sound. I counted at least 3, maybe more. They circled our position slowly, methodically, as if studying us. Occasionally, one would stop and stand motionless for minutes at a time, just at the edge of where our vision failed. Around 3 in the morning, Thomas whispered, "It knows we're leaving." I asked how he could tell. He pointed to the valley. "They're not blocking us, just watching, like they're making sure we go." His words settled over us like cold water. Whatever stalked these woods didn't want to kill us. It wanted us gone. Dawn came slowly, the sky turning from black to gray in gradual degrees that felt like mercy. When there was finally enough light to see the trail, Brennan gave the order. We moved down from the ridge in single file, weapons ready, eyes forward. The shapes that had circled us through the night were gone, but the forest remained silent, watchful, waiting. We didn't speak. Every sound we made, every footfall, every breath, felt like an intrusion. The trees pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even morning light couldn't penetrate. We moved through perpetual twilight, and I had the growing sense that we were being herded, guided along a path that had been chosen for us. By mid-morning, we reached a section of forest we should have recognized. We had passed through it on the second day, marked a cedar near a fallen log, set stakes to indicate the survey line. But the cedar was gone, not cut down, not uprooted, just absent. The log remained, but the tree that had stood 15 feet from it no longer existed. In its place was empty ground, undisturbed, covered in moss that looked decades old. Fletcher stopped walking. "That tree was here," he said, his voice hollow. "I saw Thomas mark it. I stood right there and watched." Thomas nodded slowly. "It was here," he confirmed. David and Peter exchanged glances, but said nothing. Brennan stared at the empty space for a long moment, then turned and kept walking. "We don't stop," he said. An hour later, we found the stakes we'd set. 3 of them, driven into the ground at quarter-mile intervals, each one marked with the company seal. But they had been moved. They now formed a triangle, points facing back the way we'd come, as if marking a boundary. And beside each stake lay a pile of stones, stacked with precision, topped with something organic, dark and twisted, that none of us wanted to examine closely. We left them where they were and pushed on. The trail began to climb, rising toward the high ground where we'd first entered the forest. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't slow. None of us did. Behind us, I heard that sound again, branches breaking in sequence, keeping pace. It wasn't trying to hide anymore. By early afternoon, we reached a clearing we recognized, the place where we'd made our first camp. The fire pit was still there, cold and gray, ringed with stones. But in the center of the clearing, something new had appeared. A structure, crude but deliberate, made from branches lashed together with strips of bark. It stood 8 feet tall, roughly human in shape, with long arms that hung nearly to the ground and a head that tilted at an unnatural angle. We stopped at the edge of the clearing. No one moved closer. The structure faced the trail we'd just emerged from, as if it had been placed there to greet us, or to warn us. Thomas gripped his rifle tighter. "That wasn't here before," he said quietly. Brennan shook his head. "We circle around it. Stay wide. Don't touch it." We skirted the clearing, moving through thick underbrush to avoid passing near the structure. As we did, I glanced back at it once. In the dim light beneath the canopy, it almost looked like it was breathing, the branches expanding and contracting in a slow rhythm. I forced my eyes forward and kept moving. The final stretch of forest seemed endless. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow held potential threat. Time stretched and compressed in ways that made no sense. Minutes felt like hours, and I couldn't tell if we'd been walking for 1 day or 3. My sense of direction, usually reliable, had abandoned me completely. I followed Brennan blindly, trusting that he knew the way out. Then, without warning, the trees thinned. Light broke through the canopy, real light, warm and yellow. The silence lifted. I heard birds calling, wind moving through branches, the normal sounds of a living forest. Ahead, through a final line of spruce, I saw open sky. We stumbled into the clearing at the trailhead, like men surfacing from deep water. The wagon road was still there, rutted and familiar. Beyond it, the settlement lay visible in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys. Fletcher dropped to his knees and put his hands on the bare ground, as if confirming it was real. Thomas leaned against a tree, eyes closed, whispering something I couldn't hear. The Reed brothers stood together, arms around each other's shoulders, staring back at the forest we'd just escaped. Brennan walked to the edge of the tree line and looked back into the shadows. For a long moment, he stood there, perfectly still. Then he turned to us. "We tell no one what we saw," he said. "We report difficult terrain, poor timber quality, and recommend an alternate route. Nothing more." His voice carried weight and finality. "No one will believe us anyway." We walked into the settlement that evening, exhausted and hollow-eyed. The company foreman took one look at us and asked what happened. Brennan gave him the report, short and professional. "Rough ground, dense undergrowth, low-quality timber, survey incomplete." The foreman frowned but didn't push. He paid us for the days worked and told us to rest before taking on another contract. That night, in a boarding house bed, I lay awake and listened to the sounds of civilization. Voices through walls, footsteps on floorboards, dogs barking in the street. Normal sounds, safe sounds. But beneath them, in the spaces between, I heard echoes of that forest silence. And I knew it would follow me. The next morning, Fletcher was gone. He'd left before dawn, taking only his pack and his pay. No one knew where he went. Thomas said he wasn't surprised. "Some things you can't just walk away from," he said. "They follow." He left 2 days later, heading south toward the border. I never saw him again. David and Peter Reed stayed in the area, taking work on the docks. I'd see them occasionally in town. But they never spoke about those 6 days. If our eyes met, they'd nod once and move on. Some silences are easier to keep than break. Brennan stayed longest. He took another survey contract, this one further south, safer terrain. But he changed, grew quieter, drank more. One night, months later, I found him in a tavern. Staring into a glass of whiskey, I sat down across from him. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said without looking up, I went back. I didn't ask why, I just waited. He continued, his voice low. Wanted to see if it was real, if we'd imagined it, got turned around, let fear make us see things that weren't there. He took a drink, found the trail, went in about a mile, found one of our stakes, the ones that got moved. It was back in its original position, and next to it, he paused. Next to it was something else, a piece of cloth from Fletcher's jacket. I recognized the tear in it. He looked at me then, eyes red-rimmed and haunted. He went back in there, Samuel. Don't know why. But he did, and something wanted me to know. He finished his whiskey and stood. Don't ever go back, he said. Promise me. Whatever's in those woods, it keeps what it takes. I promised. He left the settlement a week later, and I never heard from him again. That was 37 years ago. I'm an old man now, living in Victoria, far from the timber camps and survey lines of my youth. I never took another contract on Vancouver Island, never went near those northern forests again. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is still and the house is quiet, I hear it. That silence, that pressing, watchful absence of sound. And I know it hasn't forgotten me. The railway line was never completed through that valley. Company records list it as economically unfeasible. But I know better. I know other crews were sent in after us. I know some of them didn't come back. And I know that somewhere in those dark woods, among trees that have stood for centuries, something still walks upright on two legs, marking its territory, counting those who enter, and making sure that some of us leave to spread the warning. The Coast Salish peoples who lived in that region for thousands of years have stories about the forest spirits, the tall ones who walk like men but are not men, who guard the deep woods and punish those who show disrespect. We didn't know those stories when we entered. We were surveyors, practical men, believers in maps and measurements. We learned differently. Last week, I read in the newspaper that a new logging operation has been proposed for Northern Vancouver Island. Modern equipment, experienced crews, promises of jobs and prosperity. The articles show maps, and I recognize the area. It's the same valley, the same forest. I thought about writing to the company, telling them what I know, warning them. But who would believe an old man's story about shadows and silence and footprints that shouldn't exist? So I'll say it here, and hope that somehow these words find those who need them. There are places in this world that don't belong to us. Places that tolerate our presence only briefly, that watch and wait and remember. The forest of Northern Vancouver Island is one of them. If you must go there, go with respect. Don't stray from marked paths. Don't camp alone. Don't ignore the warnings when the birds stop singing and the silence presses in. And if you see something tall and upright moving between the trees, something that walks like a man, but isn't one, something that watches you with eyes that hold no recognition of your humanity, don't run. Don't scream. Just back away slowly, keep your eyes down, and leave. Because it's counting. And when the count is complete, it decides who stays and who carries the mark away, branded with the memory of what waits in the darkness between the trees. I carry that mark still. I see it sometimes, in mirrors, in photographs, in the faces of the few others who survived encounters they can't explain. We recognize each other without speaking. We know what it means to have walked where we shouldn't have, to have been counted and released, to spend the rest of our lives waiting for the sound of branches breaking in sequence, moving closer in the dark. The forest remembers. And so do I.